fighting with normal weapons, whereas the ISIS has got tanks and mortars. The international community needs to defend them.
Kurdish forces are doing what they can to hold off the advancement of Islamic State militants, but top officials with the United States Pentagon admit airstrikes alone will not be able to save the Syrian border town of Kobani. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. A Syrian rights group says militants with Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant now control a portion of the town of Kobani. Militants have been making steady gains to expand their control of areas in Iraq and Syria, despite intensified airstrikes by the United States-led coalition. Already, some 400 people have been killed in the battle and nearly 200,000 others have fled the region. The Turkish government has tanks and troops at the border, but so far has not intervened. ISIL has claimed responsibility for the beheadings of 2 American journalists and 2 British aid workers, and the parents of 26-year-old Abdul Rahman Kasig, who was captured in Syria last year while doing humanitarian work, fear their son will be next. US President Barack Obama has called on Muslims around the world to reject ISIL. In September, American Muslim leaders gathered at Washington's National Press Club and presented a scathing 17-page letter condemning the terrorist group's actions. But should Muslims have to defend Islam or apologize for the actions of a few? Well, joining us now is Aslan Iftikhar. He's an international human rights lawyer and founder of the online website themuslimguy.com. Aslan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let us start with that basic question. Should Muslims like yourself have to defend your religion and its practices against groups like ISIL?
No. You know, there is no concept of collective guilt or collective responsibility anywhere in the world. You know, the acts of a few should not ever be used to magnify and represent the greater demographic whole. So theoretically, no, but sadly and practically today, yes, because of the fact that, you know, when groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda do things, these are the media narratives that are plastered on Western media outlets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so it is important from a practical vantage point for Muslim leaders, scholars, and public intellectuals to condemn ISIS, obviously because of the fact that they put Islam in their own name, and we refuse to have anything associated with Islam or Muslims and that murderous, barbaric group.
So there you have it. You said it. We have the actions of a few, which being interpreted as a general view. There's a lot of generalization here. Sure. ISIS carries out actions which can only be described as barbaric when we look at the beheadings of people that it's carried out and its other actions on the battlefield as well. And it carries all that out in the name of religion. So how much of a distortion, total abuse of the religion is this?
You know, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are part of what experts refer to as the new jihadi cool, which is essentially a global street gang that tries to recruit disenfranchised young men from around the world on the internet via social media like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. You know, I always try to remind people, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not the X-Men. They're not like the Transformers. You know, these are a ragtag bunch of undereducated, underemployed, disenfranchised people who are not rocket scientists or brain surgeons. And so they will be stopped one day, and it is an issue that we're dealing with right now. And I think that the world community is starting to see the importance of, you know, tapping out ISIS. But, you know, this is part and parcel of what's going on in many parts of the world today.
What does ISIL stand for? I mean, at the moment, it looks like it stands for wanton destruction, murder, general mayhem.
Yeah.
What does it stand for, if anything?
You know, I always like to say that ISIS is a dystopic cult, Anand. ISIS is a dystopic cult similar to the Khmer Rouge were in Cambodia, where essentially they have their own ideology of wanton destruction, and they will not listen to, you know, logic and reason. It's a dystopic cult. Again, it's similar. I always tell people during my television interviews that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are about as Muslim as the Lord's Resistance Army should be considered Christian. And we know that Joseph Kony actually started this Christianist terrorist organization, which essentially recruited child soldiers all throughout Africa but we never saw the Christianity, the Christianist aspect of that being played out. We don't see, when we have mass shootings here in the United States and, people leave behind diatribes in their suicide notes, claiming to act, through some, distorted view of their own religious worldview. The problem is that Islam and Muslims are placed on a double standard today. There's a higher standard for Muslims to condemn acts of terror, whereas the same acts committed by other people with other demographic, ethnic, or religious backgrounds don't, sadly, have that same burden.
So there you have a group like ISIS, which, as you've just called them, a dystopic cult, causing a lot of violence, murder, mayhem across Syria, across Iraq. So why do young Muslims across the world pack their bags, move across the world, and join groups like this? They want to fight on their side. What's the attraction?
That's a good question, Anand. And I always have to remind people that ISIS did not create itself yesterday. It is created, factually speaking, because of the vacuum that, with the lack of foreign intervention during the Syrian civil war crisis, where Bashar al-Assad was slaughtering hundreds and thousands of his own people on a daily basis. And because the foreign countries were not willing to have the political backbone to back, the early pro-democracy Syrian rebels, ISIS was created out of this vacuum. And so the recruiting tool via social media is that, countries like Syria and Iraq are broken, their governments are oppressing them, come fight the quote-unquote good fight with us. I mean, it's a completely, simplistic, reductive recruiting tool, but when you're reaching out to people who have high school educations, who are wannabe rappers or former bouncers at nightclubs and are not rocket scientists, but also have no sense a sense of purpose in life, they might feel a little bit of an affinity to join this global street gang.
Actually, Slate.com referred to them as psychopathic thrill seekers. One other question. I mean, you've gone through some of the reasons why we have a group like ISIL that's emerged in this part of the world. But to what extent did American foreign policy contribute to the rise of this group? American support for totalitarian regimes, drone attacks, things like that.
Listen. If you look at the manifestos of Al-Qaeda or any terrorist organization, 94.6% of their entire manifestos are grievances against Western and particularly American foreign policy. I mean, it would be intellectually dishonest to say that American foreign policy plays no role in this. In this case, we're dealing with the Syrian civil war and, what Bashar al-Assad was doing to his own people. And I do think part of the reason that ISIS was created was because of, again, this perceived notion that Western countries, Western powers, primarily the United States, NATO, and even regional key players like Qatar or Turkey weren't doing enough to help quell the bloodshed in Syria. And so, again, nothing in our world ever takes place in a vacuum, and we always have to understand the nuance and the historical and cultural context. If we start, reducing things to silly, reductive 12-second sound bites, that's what's really going to push our global narrative in a negative direction.
One final question for you, Arslan, and that is, can ISIL be defeated? And is that defeat going to take place on the battlefield?
Yes, they can, and they will be defeated. 10 years ago, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda in Iraq were supposed to be, again, the X-Men or the Transformers, the worst terrorists known to mankind. And now, people are reacting to ISIS as though, Al-Qaeda never existed. So they will be defeated, and they'll be defeated strategically for the purpose of because they made a strategic blunder in calling themselves a caliphate. Even though there are 57 Muslim-majority nations on the face of the earth, some of them ostensibly very religious and very conservative, no country on earth would ever have the audacity to call itself an Islamic caliphate. And so just by that statement alone and that utterance, I think that it's quite clear that there are 57 mortal enemies to ISIS all around the world. And they will come to an end one day. It may take days, it may take weeks, it may take months. But, we were able to cut off the snake's head of Al-Qaeda when we killed Osama bin Laden, and so ISIS is going to end one day as well.
Okay, sir. Arslan Iftikhar, thanks for joining us. We are going to take a break right now. Next, the battle against militants with the Islamic State. Our panel of experts discusses military and political options. Stay with us. You're on The Heat.